Hello, everyone, and welcome to Achates Inspires. We're so delighted you could be with us today to explore a topic that's certainly on all of our minds. Is this the end of the solo artistic director-led institution? A reminder that the session was first broadcast at 1 p.m. on the 23rd of January, and if you do have any questions while watching or thoughts you'd like to share, please do so in the comments section, and members of the Achates team will be on hand to respond to those. So, on to today's conversation. The last few years have been particularly turbulent for the cultural sector as the effects of COVID and the cost of living crisis have really started to take their toll. This has been highlighted by the sense of a mass exodus of artistic leadership announced particularly in the last 2 years. In some cases, the resignation of artistic directors has marked the end of a long-term tenure, a natural moving on point, you might say. But in others, the decision to move on came more unexpectedly, either with those in post having only taken up those roles in recent years, or as the result of a seismic change like the removal of Arts Council funding. Naturally, this slew of resignations has sparked a widespread conversation across the sector about the very structure of our leadership models. Many leaders in the field spoke out about the challenges artistic directors are facing, with Tariq Iskander from the Battersea Arts Centre laying it out in stark detail on social media, citing the precarious funding environment, the cost of living crisis, unprecedented inflationary pressures, staff shortages, and a lack of sustainable and sustained investment. Further, in a BBC Radio 4 broadcast on the topic, Amanda Parker shone light on the fact that, despite recent steps to make leadership within the sector more representative of UK society, in some cases, there seems to have been a failure to ensure that those elevated to leadership roles are sufficiently supported to make the transition a success. And as a result, many individuals are stepping back after just a few years. For many, this is not an entirely surprising turn of events, as several in the sector have argued that the current leadership structure has been untenable for a very long time. And in fact, the challenges of recent years have simply exposed the reality and weaknesses that have long been inherent in our models. When considered within the context of the increasingly complex macro environment in which sector leaders are expected to now operate, a much needed discussion is now underway about our current leadership model and whether it is indeed fit for purpose in the current climate. Does a model which places, in many cases, the weight of chief executive responsibility alongside the requirement to deliver an artistic vision fit with the increasing demands placed on leaders today? How can artistic leaders meaningfully respond to the audiences and communities their organisations seek to serve, whilst also maintaining overall responsibility for the business and the team within it? Are the expectations on an artistic director too big for one person, especially if there is a want to make work at the same time within the economic and social landscape we're asking leaders to face today? Is it fair to expect one individual to carry both the artistic integrity of an organisation and its business viability? Is that what's actually happening? How do executive directors fit into this bigger picture? Are boards expecting too much of a leader? Will some cultural organisations end up without artistic leadership at all? Many organisations who have seen the departure of their artistic director in recent years have not replaced the single artistic director position like for like. Some have created a leadership structure which sees a single chief executive at the helm with creative associate positions at other points in the executive team. Yet others are exploring joint modules, changing the title or nature of the role, or exploring more thoroughly the relationship between artistic and executive directors. Today, we'll explore just a few of these questions and interrogate the leadership models that we have now and whether they are truly fit for the future. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by two incredible leaders in the sector to explore this issue and to offer their insights from first-hand experience. We're joined by Saad Adin Saeed. Hi, Saad. You give us a little wave.
Hi, Vicky.
Saad is an international curator who initiates and develops partnerships between communities, creatives, and institutions to reshape the future of towns and cities. His purpose is to rethink and reimagine the potential of citizens as societal foundation for leadership and decision-making. He is the CEO and artistic director of New Art Exchange, co-director and co-founder of Citizens in Power, and co-chair of Contemporary Visual Arts Network. We're also joined today by Sarah Wajid. Hiya, Sarah.
Hi Vicky, good to see you.
Thank you. Sarah is the co-CEO of Birmingham Museums Trust, making her the first British Asian director of a major museum in the UK. She has worked in the arts for 30 years in various roles and sectors, including as an editor of artist books and as a literary journalist. She has also taught contemporary African literature at the School of Oriental and African Studies and held visiting fellowships at the University of East London and the University of Leicester. She is a judge of the Museum and Heritage Awards and has been a judge of the Museum Activism Awards, as well as a trustee of the Pitt Rivers Museum. She is a recipient of the Arts Council Changemakers Award for underrepresented leaders in the sector. In 2014, she founded the Museum Detox Network for people of colour in museums in order to promote anti-racism and equality through solidarity. Thank you both so much for joining us today. So that's absolutely enough for me. I definitely like to start off by understanding your experiences of leadership in the sector. So I wonder if I could come to you both in turn to ask about your own experience of leadership. What does it look like for you and where you find yourself now? And do you think the role or the expectations put on leaders have shifted in your experience? Sarah, can I start with you, please?
Sure. Loved your queuing up of the debate as it is a very spot on, acute sort of summary of where we're at. And listening to you talk there, I was reflecting on something I've been thinking about recently, which is about walking the tightrope of being a leader who brings your whole self, as the language, the sort of more popular language recently, authentic whole self, to your position as a cultural leader. There's a lot of encouragement now for us to be our whole selves and not to have a kind of professional persona over here and a values based, you know, type of 360-degree entirely inhabit your role as a leader. And at the same time, I run Birmingham Museums Trust, which is a civic museum organisation, publicly funded, of course, to represent the whole of the people of Birmingham. And I often wrestle with this. Where is the line for me, particularly as a woman of colour in a city which is 17% of the population is Pakistani? So, being a Pakistani museum director and the first Pakistani museum director in the UK, that has a particular, I guess, there's a particular weight and privilege for me to embody that, but also to think about what does that mean to fully be an anti-racist, a leader, all of those things in the role, but also to keep party politics, for example, to one side, to not express that because that could be alienating or inappropriate for some of the people who we represent and serve in Birmingham. And so that's just one of the kind of recent versions or flavors of that tightrope and how to manage that. And in the current climate, we've had the same government for the last 13 years. A lot of people are expecting a change of government this year. What has that looked like for us in museums and heritage in the midst of, particularly in the heat of the 2021 and 20 to 22 moments around culture wars? That was a particularly acute uh, kind of manifestation of how to embody all of that. I'll quickly touch now on some of my leadership. The actual question you asked me, which was about my relationship to leadership, which is that I felt I was a very atypical leader, in that I didn't come into being CEO from that having been an ambition. I think I was about 46, 47 when I took up the role 3 years ago. And it wasn't, those roles of kind of being the top bod, top brass in a large, sort of mainstream organisation wasn't my trajectory at all. My mother's an activist. I saw her be part of something called the Black Members Committee of the National Union of Journalists as a teenager. So I was watching the solidarity of anti-racist journalists in the UK in the 80s and 90s. And that was very much basically a resistance movement. They were hard lefties doing anti-racist work collectively in the culture sector, and that's how that was my training ground, if you want. That was what I was watching coming into. So my attitude to culture was basically born of that kind of resistance mode of like, I want to get in there to change you might say a softer, maybe a more New Labour version of that language, be a reformer. So I came in as a reformer, but wanting very much to see change and be a disruptor. And so that doesn't sit with like being of the establishment, being the establishment. And it was a very slow change for me over about 25 years, with huge amounts of support from a lot of allies, collaborators, anti-racists. And it really was only through 10 years of being part of this collective of people of colour who work in museums that I started to recognise that some of the attributes or behaviours that I had and the things that I was trying to change in the sector was being understood as, or there was a language in which this was leadership, or this could be understood as trying to make a change in society. And that just wasn't what I saw around me in the establishment, major leaders of national museums particularly. I'd never put those two things together. They were absolutely in opposition. But as the time went on and I could see how we in Museum Detox all seemed to be collaborating together to co-lead Museum Detox as a collective, I could see that there was a way of bringing that sort of more activist, collectivist model of leadership into something perhaps that could make me comfortable in leading somewhere large like Birmingham Museums Trust, if we could start to replicate this. And just 2 or 3 quick examples. I remember at one point in my career I was job sharing, as it happens with an Italian woman who had gone on maternity leave, and she came back, and it was an Asian-led organisation about Asian arts. And the experience of job sharing with her introduced me to the idea of sort of power sharing. Quite a small organisation, only about 4 or 5 of us, but she had very complementary skills. At another time, I was running something called the Black Media Journal as an editor, and my deputy editor was a Caribbean working class man with very, very different lived experience than me. And I remember that the 2 of us worked together very well with that different lived experience. And so coming towards Birmingham Museums Trust and seeing the overwhelming challenges of the shrinking of the public finances, I thought that it looked really hard. And although I really wanted to do a lot of it, I thought there's a lot of that where I'm going to be out of my depth. And putting a woman of colour at the helm of a prominent organisation where she's out of her depth in anything, that's not going to end well for the woman or for the organisation. And that's when I had the realisation that I could do this in a job share, but only if Zach Mensa wanted to do it with me. And then that's when I went that direction. And we've been working together in this job for the last 3 years, and it has made all the difference in the world to be part of a job share.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I've got that. I really appreciate you sharing that journey and your reflections. I've got so many questions I really want to dig into, but I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind if I can first sort of pass to Saad for your reflections on your experience, because I feel like I'm going to come back at you both with lots of juicy things. So Saad, can I turn to you and just sort of get your reflections on your experience of leadership in the sector and what you've sort of been seeing happening in your sort of journey?
Yes, of course. And I just want to pick up on some brilliant points that actually Sarah put forward and where I recognize myself in. It's 2 main questions in terms of maybe one of the challenges when you are in a position of leadership in terms of an organization. One is an ongoing question, is how do you keep your authenticity? Where the question is about bringing yourself, and it's not even about values, it's about the vision of the world. And we all have our unique vision of the world. And then how can you also create a space that welcomes and speaks to everyone, especially at a day where, we have so many questions around society and discourse in a way where it is so divisive, and where cultural organizations can really play a bigger role in terms of bringing society together. So that's one. And then the other one is the challenge of keeping your curiosity and keeping your excitement as a leader whenever you come to the job. And how do you balance that with the heavy responsibility, especially when you come from underrepresented communities and you're really a voice there that is trying to lead forward for an important societal agenda. So I built probably most of my career around exploring the idea of how to curate relationships around communities using creativity, creating relationships that lead to impact. I've started my career internationally and came to the UK around maybe 8 years ago. And I've started my journey in the cultural sector as a volunteer 7 years ago, and just started my way exploring, again, like Sarah, not really trying to become a leader of an organization, but really trying to understand how I can deliver impact. And I feel that when we speak about leadership, it's really important to recognize that there is as much leadership when you're a volunteer, than when you're an audience member, than when you're an artist, than when you're any member of the organization. And those, I feel, are now becoming bigger questions when we're looking at being in a public service and being organizations that are delivering impact, organizations that are there to maybe play a bigger role than they have ever played. So that comes again with a lot of challenging questions, a lot of responsibility, and a lot of heavy weight, especially again when you are a leader that comes with a vision around reshaping a society that is celebrating opportunity for very often underrepresented voices, voices that I feel are the most exciting and are the most visionary today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Saad. What's really sort of strikes me, I mean, there's obviously lots of synergies in sort of what you are saying in terms of your journeys, but within your own distinct experiences. But what really jumped out at me from both of your reflections that I'd love to just sort of understand your take on a little bit more is the importance of collaboration and relationships in terms of what it means to be a leader, and however you're defining that. Sarah, you spoke about it sort of from your experience with Museum Detox and that kind of collaborative way of working, which has led you to a kind of co-leadership model now, and Saad obviously with that kind of lens of community building. I suppose what I'm wondering is, when we think about those that have been given leadership responsibility in that sort of more kind of the kind of hierarchical definition, I suppose, of leadership as it sort of exists in many places within the sector, how you are seeing the sort of evolution of your own practice as you sort of sit within those hierarchies, but bring such an ethos of collaboration and partnership, sort of relationship building to the work that you're doing, how you're combining those two elements. Does it feel like a dichotomy? Does it feel like a clash? Or is it something that actually you're feeling you're able to kind of navigate your way through to sit both in that kind of hierarchy as it was within the sector in terms of holding a chief executive and these kind of titles, but creating a model around yourselves that speaks much more truly to, I think you both referred to it as kind of your own authentic self and your own authentic kind of ethos. Saad, do you want to, can we come to you first on any thoughts on that?
Yes, of course. Well, I do think first, just maybe reflecting, and again, this is my reflection on 7 years in the cultural sector, and it's not a historic one, but maybe is a more of a contemporary reflection. But I do feel that just within those 7 years, the conversation around collaboration has changed from one that is value-based, to one that is existential today. Collaboration to me was a want and now is a need, especially as we are within a sector that is getting less funded and is going through challenges that are bigger than I have ever experienced in those last years. So now collaboration is becoming just a real key to everything we do. And I do feel that maybe, and this is maybe a reflection just to the leaders that I encounter, I do feel that I come from maybe a practice where collaboration is part of a DNA. So the question of collaboration came first, the CEO title came later, and not the other way around. So it feels to me that it comes quite naturally, but it is always interesting when you come with that vision of values and you come to organizations that maybe don't have that culture, then it becomes quite an interesting journey in terms of how we as leaders in its wider sense, as people who are working within organizations, so that we get away from just be executed, as people who are working within organizations who have a vision that is based on value, how do we reshape culture? It's very often a painful journey, it's very often a long journey. It is a necessary one. I personally secretly enjoy it. It comes with challenges that feels really, really important. But I can see that conversations around partnerships, around collaborations are becoming, again, part of the DNA, maybe not in the mainstream. It feels that there is a growing movement that understands that if we are to meet our potential as a cultural sector in terms of shapers of society, then we have to build smarter relationships, smarter collaborations, smarter partnerships, and not with wider communities, communities of creatives, as much as communities of organizations and communities of citizens.
Brilliant, thank you. Sarah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I could just, quite keen to just speak to what Saad just said, really, and sort of, digest the truths he's laid down there are very juicy. I'll try and bring something to bear from my experience as well, which is, I think, New Art Exchange is a cool organisation. Frankly, it's a cool brand. It's got the alignment perhaps with Saad's previous work, and with the collaborative way that his practice is. I would say it's relatively aligned. Maybe from the outside, I've got a kind of different. Whereas something like Birmingham Museums Trust that's been around since 1885, and probably had about 170 full-time equivalent staff when I joined, and is a million objects, and is was until recently part of the city council, and frankly a bastion of celebration of European artistic excellence. That's what most Victorian civic museums are. Is quite a different beast. And I would also say, and I think it's only fair to surface some of my own privilege. I spoke before about my upbringing, but also I went to private schools. I went to private schools and public schools. So my relationship of, I went to school with children of, mainly kind of children of lawyers and doctors, not children of lords and judges and stuff, but, privilege definitely there. And so my relationship to the establishment, and I grew up in the suburbs of London. So my relationship to the heart of the establishment is also a mixed one. So I can put on the Radio 4 hat and the Radio 4 voice and go on something like Front Row without too much discomfort. It's not too much of a stretch for me, really. That's what I was bred to, in many ways. My mother was also a BBC producer by the time that her career ended. So, I must be honest about that, kind of my subject position. But also that it's difficult, I think, for any leader, whether a leader of colour or one from an activist background, when there are positions and questions that you must enforce, that isn't what you really want to do. Like recently, we've had a lot of financial problems in Birmingham City Council. I'm sure people might well be aware that the city declared bankruptcy, and we've had to be very judicious financially and swerve quite quickly around some of that. So some of our plans for the coming years, for example, we've had to make some decisions quite quickly in quite a hierarchical way that don't sit that comfortable. They're not a lovely thing to suddenly tell your team. I know we said we were going to do all this collective business planning and everybody was going to have their views heard and it was all going to be a lovely sort of, thinking together, and we would do this thoughtful chin stroking stuff and all of your views are important and we'd be democratic. But now we've got an emergency and I'm having to make some quite old school decisions quite quickly and just impose them from above in a very traditional old school hierarchical way. And, that's not the most popular thing with teams when you're telling them one thing and then doing another. Having Zach as a co-leader means that we are checking in on each other, and of course the rest of the senior leadership team and the trustees, about how this is landing. And sometimes we have different opinions on that, and we sit at a different point in that axis. And so we might be like, well, look, this is Zach's, for example, from a software programming background. His degree was in computer science. So he is very versed in agile ways of working and experimental things that are, if you're making a decision that is reversible, he's, for instance, a great proponent on the good enough for now, safe enough to try. Like, inch forward if it's reversible, if you're not breaking anything, just do it, and undo it if you can undo it. Now, that's all good, except for once things are not reversible and you switch into a different mode, all of that is, that's why not everybody wants to do leadership, because learning this and doing it out loud in front of everybody clumsily means that you're making mistakes visibly. And I'm just fortunate that I've got to a certain stage in my life where my shoulders are broad enough that I can, I won't sleep, I won't lose an entire night's sleep over things like that. But 10 years ago, I would have been like, everybody hates me, I'm making disgusting decisions, I'm being a hypocrite, this is bogus, and I'm a schmuck, basically. But what can you do? You compromise, you muddle through. Maybe as we go through this process, I will learn a better way. But the other thing that is worth saying is that there is an insurance policy I put for myself by being job share, is that it's not only job share, it's working part time. So I give myself, I'm basically gifted myself 2 days a week effectively to recover, or re-up, in the words of Galen Gould, a great career coach and curator and artist who many of you might know. Is that re-up is so important, because if you work that tank till it's empty, you've got no joy. You've got no joy to, put in the world, to, inspire others with, to be in a good mood when crap stuff happens. And you need that joy, absolutely central. But it's 3 years now, and it's not a choice that everyone can make financially to work part-time. And Zach is, also now started taking on other pieces of work beyond, and I probably will need to do that before too long. But I gifted myself that thing because I could tell that the resilience required wasn't going to be within the fold. It wasn't going to be within the fold of the job. And that's not that replicable for that many people. But it has been absolutely vital to me, because I need to listen and get inspiration and go to staff exhibitions, read more widely than I would if I was working 5 days a week, all of that stuff. And that might sound luxurious, but to me, it feels like that's what a leader needs at this point.
Can I just make a really, just highlight something that, again, Sarah is just articulating so brilliantly, which is really important in terms of when we talk about leadership and models, is the right to explore, and we don't have the answers. And it's so beautiful to just hear you, Sarah, in terms of laying down how not only your leadership is taking place in the work, but also in terms of how that partnership is an ongoing relationship that needs to be figured out day after day. And I think that's really, really important in terms of when we talk about models. One of the key things is understanding that, and it's true, we are in crisis. It's an economical crisis, and it's an identity crisis. It's a crisis of vision. We don't have all the same vision of what not only this country or the cultural industry, but the world should look like as we go forward. And within that, there is a real opportunity for the cultural sector to really lead if it is open to exploration, and if it is open to really allow other models of leadership to take place. And to do that, we need to allow leaders to fail, succeed, re-fail, and re-succeed. If that is not put in place, it's just going to become a boring do and redo how things have been done for a very long time. And we could do things that are way more exciting. I mean, I just wanted to make that point because it was fascinating to hear Sarah articulate that.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that was both of you a really, really important point to make. And it kind of makes me think, in terms of our kind of next point I'd love to get your take on is, part of the conversation that's been kind of coming up around this sort of leadership question, as it were, is that there's an argument to be made by many that our current business model isn't fit for the current landscape, and as a result, a leadership model can't therefore be either, because you're slightly strangling one off in order to sort of achieve the other. What's your sort of perspective on this? I mean, Sarah, if we could start with you, because you obviously mentioned, you sort of alluded to some of the challenges within your business model from an economic perspective with the recent sort of council situation. It'd be really great to hear your perspective on that kind of business model scenario.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, one of the things that occurs to me is how heavily we have lent on our board of trustees in the last 3 years. That is free time, which if we had to calculate we've got trained accountants on the board, we've got people who have run, mega events and mega projects. Our chair is a former CEO of UK Athletics. That would be astronomical, like if we had to, cost up that time. And what kind of people who are highly skilled, who can afford to give their volunteer time to a museum, what kind of people can do that? Like, overwhelmingly, it's people who are economically comfortable, right? And not to take away anything from our trustees, and our board is as probably one of the more ethnically diverse and probably slightly class diverse boards of a major museum in the country, but there's almost like a hidden sort of thing there in the model, isn't there? Is that it's essentially being that governance model is, I'm thinking of like probably about 4 or 5 what you would say is kind of people on the board who, if you looked at a board like in the 1950s, would be that sort of demographic on the board, who are giving huge amounts of time. And then at the front of the organisation, you see 2 relatively young, less so in my case, more so in Zach's case, relatively young people of colour fronting the organisation. Zach's working class, so at least one of them from a working class background, and that looks like that. Like, that's a lot of change to see, it's visibly different. But in the background, how different really is that change? How radically, fundamentally different is that business model? And you're not going to see, for instance, a working class woman of colour as a chair of Birmingham Museums Trust, probably until that position is not an unpaid position. Do you see what I'm getting at? So that's all part of the model here, which is unsustainable, because frankly, the model for public culture, as you alluded to there, is totally bust. Like, the amount of money it takes to keep something like a museums trust with 1 million objects really delivering for more than 1 million people of Birmingham is light years away from the public purse that we have now. And we're working really hard on trying to think of new commercial models. We're busting a gut like all of the other regional museums to maximise all the commercial and all of commercial income that we can. But there is a limit, because what we do is not commercial and should never be entirely commercial, because if it was just working within free market economics, then we might as well be an Odeon cinema. We're trying to do something else. We have different objectives. So what does that new model look like? Is what we're trying to invent, and the work that Saad's been doing around citizens and power is the direction of hope I see most, is kind of almost going back to the people and the people power, without trying to replicate the sometimes extractive and exploitative volunteer-based labour that is the other sort of model that particularly the heritage sector depends on. And so I will stop there, because I don't think I'm coming to any conclusion, but I just have to stop at some point.
Thank you, Sarah. Some really important reflections there. Saad, anything to add on the business model situation?
Yeah, I'm not sure if what I'm going to say is a very popular view, but I don't think the issue is with the model of having one voice leading an organization. But the real issue is that most of organizations are like that. So we don't have a diversity of governing models that's bring many flavors to the conversation. So to me, it's not one or the other. It's how do we ensure that we have innovation when we talk about governing models? And obviously, when we talk about that, is how do we make sure that we bring funders and key stakeholders to support that, because they are really key in terms of allowing this innovation and resourcing this innovation and resourcing the exploration to happen. But also, how do we make sure that we bring the cultural sector and its wider leadership from boards to executives to have an appetite of change? We're doing what I feel is quite an interesting exploration at the moment, and we've articulated that new art exchange within the first 3 years of its NPO is going to become a national and international blueprint of citizen-led galleries. This is something that we've been exploring quite a lot through the last year, and we are going to communicate further about this and our findings within the next couple of months. Obviously, for us, it's very important as an organization that we become that citizen-led gallery, because the governing model makes sense to the DNA of the organization, makes sense to the communities that we're trying to serve, makes sense to the community where we are placed, but also makes sense to the mission and responsibility of being the biggest cultural institution in the UK that has its mission totally focused on global ethnic majority. So we were very lucky to have the support from the key stakeholders to figure out a model of leadership that fits the mission and that fits the vision going forward. While the issue that we have in the sector is we have to fit the vision and the mission to the governing model. We have to fit the expectations of our audiences, the curation of our artists, of our programming and our thinking to the governing model. And I think that is the thing that doesn't work. I think that's a more open conversation. And again, I will repeat what I've said earlier. We do have such an incredible potential to be international leaders in terms of innovation, of governing models, in terms of reimagining what cultural sector as a public institutions can play in terms of shapers of communities, of societies, through art and creativity. But we need to open up a conversation around reimagining how governing models can deliver institutions' missions, rather than having boards, teams, and their stakeholders and their mission and vision having to fit a framework that, to be frank, is not there to deliver what we need today.
Could I jump in and respond to what Saad said? Just listening to him now, you can hear the creativity and innovation pouring out of him, right? And those ideas for change. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, could you be sat here talking about entirely radically upending the model of some of our core and NPO funded arts organisations, their governances? I'd be like, that stuff is far in the distance. That is probably not in my lifetime. And in the last 3, 4, 5 years, partly the financial situation of obviously the pandemic and Black Lives Matter and other things that have shaken, society to the core, Brexit, all of that means that we are living in, although a crisis, as Saad says, also a really exciting, creative, innovative possibility. I mean, I remember when I'm again old enough to have worked under the New Labour period, where there was economic boom and there was diversity programs and initiatives coming out of the wazoo. Like the Arts Council funded this totally uncommercial magazine that I used to run, Black Media Journal, which was a dedicated, fully funded magazine to be distributed on the free market about multicultural. That was unthinkable now, unthinkable. So that was the time I was coming up. But actually, we thought that was good to have that bounce and that resilience. But what we didn't have was the sense of kind of urgency and threat that kind of forced out us to think the unthinkable. We were actually quite complacent in many ways, looking back. And it's incredibly exciting to think that these different changes and getting to the root and branch change, the fundamentals underneath everything, that is creative leadership. That is a kind of political visioning which engines and is thrilling artistically as much as it is a challenge and difficult. I mean, who wouldn't want to dream up new ways of being? I mean, it's literally new ways of being as a society, which we can model through, happens to be arts organisations, but it could as well be housing trusts or prisons or any other aspect of society that we are trying to reinvent. And to do that with as many people in the room and many different types of people who might not have had access to that dialogue and to those levers of power is absolutely thrilling.
It really is thrilling to hear you both in your perspectives. And I wonder if it's really making me think that a lot of since last summer was certainly not when this conversation started, but was definitely when suddenly there was a sort of flurry, wasn't there, of commentary and thinking, all really crucial kind of to get it out there and to hear what people were saying. But I think what's happened since, and through a lot of the work that we are doing through Achates, through our kind of recruitment work and the kind of conversations we're having there, is something really struck me that you both said there, is that I think I'm wondering, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about a sort of move towards trying to solve this problem by just sort of at that surface level. So maybe creating slightly different executive teams that are led in slightly different ways. And so whether that's, and so I'd love to speak more about your kind of co-leadership sort of experience and a bit more of how you feel that's sort of helping to change the museum. But do you think that what's happening right now, so thinking, for example, about there's an organization who is recruiting for a creative associate instead of an artistic director that will report into a chief executive, you're seeing a lot more kind of co-models between sort of artistic directors and executive directors, or co-CEO. Do you think that is doing enough to change the models, or do you think that do you think we're maybe having the wrong conversation or the wrong focus in terms of how we actually fundamentally make this sort of more sustainable for the sector? Sarah, I wonder if I could start with you, sort of drawing as well, obviously, on your experience as a co-leader, and whether that is sort of something that you feel is sort of should be sector wide, or what's your...
I think the part of the thing that sometimes I lose myself when I talk about the co-leadership is the fact that, in a way, yes, the co-leadership is a good model, and I recommend it, and I can bore you senseless about the joys of co-leadership. But actually, the thing was, we weren't, and I think the bit that was exciting was that it was Zach and I who decided it. It wasn't the board saying we're looking for co-leaders, and to some extent, it's not even the fact that it was co-leadership. It was the fact that we felt in that moment, we are so frankly over it in terms of how things work in this sector, that we don't care if they don't want us, because this is the only way we want to do this. And it's not an option to sort of negotiate too much or compromise. It's the fact that something about that moment led us to feel bold enough that we can suggest something other than what is on the JD. And it happened to be co-leadership, but that we could almost recommission the brief from outside a little bit. Now, it happened that in our case, it was co-leadership. But what I'm interested in is, what was it about that moment that gave us that sense of entitlement and empowerment? Black Lives Matter is really significant in this. It's not just a moment or a brand. That it was the energy that we were catching at that moment was, we are people of color in this country, and we want something different. We want change, and we are serious that if we engage now with the establishment, it's a modest change that we want to job share. I mean, in the great scheme of things, it's not like revolution. Fidel Castro is not giving us any awards for job sharing. But it is that moment of saying, we will redefine, not you. And I think that is the exciting bit, because people will come up with other things other than co-leadership and other, whatever their model is. And I think how to return to that sense of, or capture or encourage that sense of, do it for your do something for yourselves, not waiting for essentially the established norms to adapt and then invite you to adapt, because actually that's not the energy that brings leaders who are going to create change. Like, we commission you to do things differently. Thank you, obediently, we will apply now for this cold leadership, seeing as you have generously allowed us to, you know what I mean? It's the sort of like, it needs to be that, like, do it yourself, slightly kind of more that energy to redefine. And again, as I know I keep harping on about, but that came not from a careerist. I'm not some, like, incredibly kind of, I'm not just like, I don't have no self-interest, right? That didn't come from a, like, because I want to be a museum director, I need this to happen. It was because I want this world to be different and social change to happen, and I'm not going to sign up for this, whatever this life is of directing big fancy museums in that traditional way. It's not me. So that's what we need to see and foster in our potential candidates and in our leaders, is that like, how do we get that spirit, and then see it in our organizations. So probably not enough, no, is a short answer. Offering to, employ people as job shares is not a big enough step. But it's not going to come from the establishments. And frankly, no offense to, recruitment consultants and organizational change people, it's not going to come from there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. So much I agree. I want to sort of applaud all of the things that you're saying, because it really rings true with I think everything that is being said here is just it's really exciting for the future, when so many conversations at the moment can be very negative and sort of rooted in where the challenges that we're facing. Saad, over to you. Any thoughts?
Yeah, Vicky, if I hear you well, the question is some organizations maybe are relooking at their structure and how they core positions, etc. And it not only is that enough, but is this just a ticking box exercise, a look good exercise where I think it doesn't really matter, because to me the economy of the cultural sector is changing so much that shifting organizations is no more a look good exercise. It is an existential exercise. And if you have to do it, and if you don't do it right, you will become irrelevant, because when we look at the next 10 years, there is probably less funding and less support that is going to come to this sector. And therefore, you have to really rethink about your governing model. You have to really rethink about the structure of your leadership, because if you make it right, you become more resilient, you become smarter, more creative, more innovative. So we moved from the ticking box exercise, we moved from the looking good to something that is becoming more necessary. And within this crisis, which we already see in how many institutions it is affecting, every single day, every single week, every single month, we're losing talent, we're losing great organizations, and we know that the sector is going to become more and more challenging, at least in the next maybe even 10 years, to be honest. So again, it's looking at that change and shifting and making sure that our organizations are dynamic, which means it's really looking at your vision, we're looking at your governing model, and governing model in its wider sense, that your leadership model is moving now to an existential question. So there is a real opportunity today to really be able to innovate, be more resilient, and so on. Yes, I hope that makes sense. It really doesn't matter if it's a ticking box or no, because it's a real question that is on the table now. It's not only value led, it's an economical question.
Brilliant. Thank you, Saad. I can't believe I'm going to have to ask our final question of our session, because I feel like I could sit with you both for the whole afternoon, but very aware that you have lots on your plate, and I'm sure many more things to go on to. But I'm sure people watching will also have lots of thoughts and questions to share in the comments. So my final question to you both, it's it's not a small one, but is what change you would want to see in the industry when it comes to this question of leadership, and what you propose we do next. Zara, would you like to go first? But please do take a few seconds if you want to think about it.
I would not like to go first. Is there any chance that Saad could go first to buy me some thinking time? That's really unfair.
No, that's okay. The hard question. Yeah. Do you want me to be honest? I don't know what change I want to see in the industry and how we propose to, or how do I propose to get started? I'm really not sure, but I am interested again in that idea of diversity. I think this is an important question, and we need to very quickly create a space where we can come to it from so many perspectives and have a dynamic answer that sits within a spectrum. We've started the conversation today, and Sarah laid that down so brilliantly, and I think it's good to come back to this as we're ending the conversation around how can you keep your authenticity while being in a sector that is in its essence, a service provider. So in a way, what I want to see in the industry is the opportunity to have as many perspectives around the table, as many lived experiences, so that we can co-shape a sector that is innovative and exciting and inspiring as we go forward.
Brilliant. Thank you, Saad. And thank you for jumping in first on quite a complex question to finish on. Sarah, what do you think?
Well, I totally second what Saad said there. I think there is something, the longer I work with Zach, the more I realise that the ideas that he brings from his working life before working in the arts, in software development, are probably informing his leadership more and more urgently and bringing more innovation than anything either of us had learned probably from working within the arts. So I think there's some cross-fertilization and opportunities beyond the arts sector to learn from the wider society, whether it be kind of health, gaming, bigger industries. Like, let's not forget that we, in some ways, although we talk about the creative industries being a big generator of, economic value, many of these funded arts organizations, we are cottage industries, tiny, fragile cottage industries compared to some of the mainstream and big and well-funded industries. I mean, just look at, high finance in this country. Look at all of the incredibly well-funded sectors. There is enormous amounts of innovation and expertise and knowledge in other sectors. And I almost feel like where we've seen that is things like, for example, the obvious to hand examples are leaders like the director of the Natural History Museum, who was formerly a senior executive at Amazon, or the person who runs the Royal Museums Greenwich, who was a shipping executive. Both of those people had no former experience working in museums, or the director of the V&A, who was an MP, who had never worked in a museum. And then immediately, all of these men, who happen all to be white men, as far as I'm aware, moved from other sectors, private industry sectors, where they had very high levels of skill and support throughout most of their career, and then moved over to the arts and occupied very important leadership roles in there. And I think there's a clue in some of the, you would say, some of the modelling of that type of license and flexibility that is afforded to those sorts of people with those sorts of careers to step into leadership. Let us see that incredible flexibility and openness to other sectors across a different kind of demographic and with a different kind of open-mindedness in leaders that we want for the next generation.
Wise words from you both indeed. Thank you so much for giving your time today and sharing your thoughts, which I I can't speak for everyone watching, although I feel like I probably can. It's given me an awful lot to really think about and reflect on, and I really appreciate it, especially with how much you have going on in your own day to day. So thank you so much. And now it just leaves me to thank everyone watching for joining this conversation today. A member of the team will stay online for the next sort of 10-15 minutes to answer any questions via the comments, but you can also always share it with Team Achates via our email address, which you'll find on our website. As many of you know, Achates is a consultancy supporting the arts and heritage sector in lots of different ways, from strategy support, feasibility studies, recruitment for development, chief executive and board positions, and organisational change and leadership training. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with the team if there is ever anything we can do to support you or your organisation. The next Achates Inspires will take place in February, and we'll be focusing on the topic of political and artistic freedom. What is the role of the cultural sector in politics? So another juicy one coming up next month. So more details on how you can sign up for that will be in your inboxes very, very soon. Thank you so much.